I slow down for a stop, Lloyd, the transmission seems to shift down quickly, as though it had almost forgotten that it was supposed to.
Mm-hmm. Does it make any kind of noise, Mr. Top?
Yes, Lloyd, but I feel the condition more than anything else. It's sort of a rough shift when I come to a stop. But when I accelerate, the transmission works very smoothly.
I see, Mr. Top, and we're glad you came in. Your transmission should work as smoothly during a downshift as it does when upshifting.
Well, will it take long to fix, or isn't it really serious?
Why, it shouldn't take too long, Mr. Top. I'll take George here with me, and we'll road test your car first. And then we'll both get right on it. Right off the bat, I'd say the throttle pressure is probably too high. If that's all it is, we can adjust it and smooth out the downshift. Want me to give you a call?
Do that, Lloyd. Call me at my office anytime after 3 this afternoon.
That's why it pays to run a road test first. You get a double check on the owner's report and find out firsthand what the exact condition is.
It sure hit the jackpot in this case. This job's really got a rough downshift, all right. Guess we'd better take the transmission apart so as we can see what's wrong inside, right?
No, wrong. That's the last thing to try, George. On Powerflite, you can fix almost any harsh shifting condition just by making sure the linkages and pressures are adjusted right. So stay on the outside, my boy.
That's right, George. You rarely have to disassemble the transmission.
Okay, masterminds. What adjustments are we going to make on this car, then?
Well, we know from our road test that the selector linkage is all right, so we'd better check the throttle linkage adjustment first.
Maybe you think we go overboard on that subject because we keep telling you to check linkage and throttle pressure every time.
Yeah. You guys act like throttle pressure is the answer to almost any transmission condition.
Well, it is, just about. The sooner you get in the habit of checking linkage and pressures first, the sooner you realize how important it is.
Okay. So I'll check throttle linkage first. But what for?
For the proper setting, of course, and for binding. After all, there's a series of connections between the accelerator pedal, the carburetor, and the transmission. You want to be sure it's set properly and operating freely. So each time you depress the accelerator, there'll be an instant increase in both engine RPM and throttle pressure. And what's more, engine RPM and throttle pressure have to be right to start with. If there's any binding or interference in the linkage, it could cause a delay between the increase in engine RPM and the increase in throttle pressure, and you'd get a harsh shifting action. That's why it's so important to have the right throttle linkage and pressure adjustment.
I'll bet George would understand the linkage tie-up better if you covered what goes on inside the unit.
Yeah, good idea. Throttle linkage, George, helps control the road speed at which the transmission shifts because it controls carburetor throttle opening and throttle pressure. Opening the carburetor throttle increases engine RPM and road speed until governor pressure at the shift valve increases enough to cause an upshift.
Remember, Lloyd's talking about what should happen, George. It won't work unless the linkage is properly adjusted and throttle pressure is on the nose.
Very true, Tech. We got to have 13 to 15 pounds throttle pressure at an engine idle of 475 to 500 RPM. And there should be an immediate increase in throttle pressure when the carburetor throttle opens slightly.
I see. Now, is that why you told Mr. Top you thought throttle pressure on his car was too high?
That's part of the story. There are other causes of the condition he mentioned, but I know the effect high throttle pressure has on downshift smoothness.
Well, George would understand that better too, Lloyd, if you rubbed his nose into that chart and explained what happens in a normal downshift.
Good suggestion. We'd better go into that. When you take your foot off the accelerator pedal, George, the carburetor returns to idle. Throttle pressure should be 13 to 15 pounds. Now, in the transmission, the shift valve is in upshift position. One of the valve lands closes off throttle pressure. So only the shift valve spring can start moving the valve into downshift position. At the other end of the shift valve, governor pressure falls off when road speed slows down. And when speed falls to about 11 miles per hour, the spring overcomes decreasing governor force and begins moving the shift valve to downshift position. This movement uncovers the throttle pressure passage. So throttle pressure moves in and helps the spring push the shift valve to downshift.
Yeah, and moving that valve to downshift relieves line pressure from the off side of the kickdown servo piston and the direct clutch. This permits the clutch to release and the kickdown band to apply.
Remember, the kickdown band is applied by a combination of line and throttle pressure on the apply side of the kickdown servo piston.
Well, that I can follow. But how is knowing it going to do me any good?
Well, it tells you how important proper throttle pressure is. And unless you know what happens during a normal downshift, you can't appreciate the job done by the servo restrictor valve.
The servo restrictor what?
That's a little understood valve in the system, George, but it does a big job during downshift. Lloyd can give you the story.
The servo restrictor valve slows down application of the kickdown servo piston during normal downshifts. So the kickdown band will engage smoothly. It's like a tiny dash pot in the system.
What the heck does it look like?
It's a spring steel reed-type valve. One end is fastened to the valve body transfer plate. The other end, shaped like an arrowhead, can lift up and down to cover and uncover a hole under the valve. Fluid at line pressure is admitted through this hole to the apply side of the kickdown servo.
Something like a mouth organ reed.
In general, yes. Instead of air, this valve controls the flow of fluid. A small hole in the arrowhead end lets fluid flow slowly to the kickdown servo when the valve is closed. An operating plug, like a plunger, is in a recessed hole on the other side of the transfer plate. It contacts the free end of the valve when pressure calls for it.
Which pressure works that plug?
Throttle pressure, George. It moves against the large end of the plug. At engine idle, remember, throttle pressure is only about 14 pounds, and this doesn't supply enough force to open the valve. When throttle pressure gets higher, the plug bends the valve up and opens the servo restrictor valve. That lets fluid flow unrestricted around the valve to the apply side of the kickdown servo.
I think I get it now. The servo restrictor valve is closed when you lift your foot off the accelerator pedal and throttle pressure is less than 15 pounds.
Well, that's what's supposed to happen when the car slows down for a stop. In other words, when road speed slows to about 11 miles, a downshift is called for by the shift valve. Application of the kickdown band is slowed down by the restricted flow of fluid through the small hole in the servo restrictor valve. And as a result, you'd get a smooth engagement of the kickdown band and a smooth downshift.
Yeah, and by this time, George, anyone can plainly see why too high a throttle pressure can cause a rough downshift.
Well, I must be a little blind, Tech, because I'm still confused.
Look, George, if that servo restrictor valve is held open because throttle pressure is too strong on the plug, there'll be a rush of fluid at line pressure to the apply side of the kickdown servo. That sudden rush of fluid into the servo will cause a sudden kickdown band application. The downshift will be rough, and it might even sound off.
Ah, now I get it. Too high a throttle pressure keeps that servo restrictor valve open.
Bullseye, George. Hooray! But before you and Lloyd get into the fix, somebody better turn this record over.
Well, now, to correct any transmission condition, we always begin by checking the fluid level when the engine's idling, right?
Okay, that I know how to do. The transmission's warm and our fluid level's right up to full, Lloyd.
Fine. That rules out low fluid level as a possible cause.
Yeah, but that rules in wrong throttle linkage adjustment or incorrect throttle pressure adjustment.
You're right. Either of those possibilities can cause too high a throttle pressure.
I suppose we look the linkage over then, hey?
Yep. Look for bent parts and possible interference. Move the transmission throttle control lever. See if it returns freely to its stop. If not, you know what to do.
Linkage works fine. No binding anywhere.
Swell. Now make sure the engine idles at 475 to 500 RPM in neutral. Then you can check the throttle linkage for improper adjustment.
Hate to disappoint you, fellas, but I can't do anything about this linkage setting. It's absolutely okay.
Disappoint us, my foot. That narrows down the field.
Okay. Do we check the pressures next?
We sure do. Checking pressures is a must. Use this 300-pound gauge and test line pressure first. Unless it's right, all other pressures could be wide of the mark.
Line pressure's okay. 250 in reverse at 1,600 RPM, and it's just under 90 pounds in the other ranges at 800 RPM.
So far, so good. Now, let's get at that throttle pressure. Remove the takeoff plug. Then use this 100-pound gauge and see if you get 13 to 15 pounds with the unit in drive and the engine idling.
Will do, Lloyd. Just give me 1 minute. Uh-oh. This transmission's got about 18 pounds throttle pressure, Lloyd. That must be our trouble, hey?
No question about it, George. That's what's giving Mr. Top that harsh downshift. You know what to do?
Well, I've got to adjust that throttle valve and bring the throttle pressure down to 14 pounds.
That's the stuff, George. Catch the oil that will drain out when you remove the plug. Watch the gauge as you adjust throttle pressure. Turn the wrench clockwise to reduce pressure to 14 pounds.
14 pounds is what I get.
Good. Shift the manual lever a couple of times between neutral and drive and see if pressure comes back to 14 when the lever is returned to drive.
She checks out okay. Still 14.
Swell. Now snap the throttle wide open quickly once or twice. You should get a momentary increase to about 80 pounds on the gauge.
Say, we're doing okay on that, too.
Good going. Reinstall the plug and torque it to about 25 foot-pounds. Add fluid to replace the fluid that drained out. Then we'll run a road test.
All right. I'll have her ready to go in a jiffy. So, correcting the high throttle pressure really improved the downshift. Mr. Top's going to be happy with this job.
It's a smooth working unit, all right.
What if the unit still had a rough downshift?
Then we'd adjust the kickdown band and road test it again. If that didn't work, we'd have to remove the valve body assembly and check it over. And if that didn't do it, then we'd pull the whole transmission.
You'll find that inside story in this reference book, George. But almost all cases of rough, closed throttle downshifts are due to incorrect linkage and pressure adjustment.
I see. So the fix we used will pretty well handle that condition.
That's the idea, pal. Now, I've got a suggestion. Let's talk about another condition. That occasional case where the engine flares up during downshift at part throttle.
Yeah, George ought to know about that. An owner may tell you he notices that the engine tends to race or run away right when he's slowed down for a turn and starts to accelerate coming out of the turn. Or this might show up when he slows down for a traffic light that suddenly changes and he tries to pick up speed again. In either case, the shift valve moved to make a normal downshift due to the slowdown in speed. Now, if the unit were working properly, the kickdown band would engage and the downshift would be completed quickly.
You mean, in this case, the downshift is delayed?
Not the action of the shift valve, but the kickdown band application, George. That's what isn't completed when the owner steps on the accelerator. So the engine flares up for a minute. Then the band applies and the car lurches forward. But before we diagnose this condition, it'll help if we talk about what happens during a normal downshift at part throttle operation.
Okay. What does happen?
Well, when the car slows to about 11 miles, the shift valve spring and the throttle pressure combine to move the shift valve to the downshift position. That opens passages and line pressure is released from the direct clutch and offside of the kickdown servo. But right about there, the driver steps on the accelerator. So the downshift has to be completed with the carburetor throttle partially open. Depressing the accelerator slightly opens the carburetor throttle and increases engine RPM. It also increases throttle pressure. Increased throttle pressure against the servo restrictor valve operating plug opens the valve and lets fluid at line pressure rush down to the apply side of the kickdown servo piston. Since line pressure was released from the piston's offside when the shift valve moved, this sudden introduction of line pressure to the apply side of the piston causes the kickdown band to apply instantly. As a result, the transmission is quickly engaged in downshift, and the increased engine RPM at part throttle provides instant acceleration.
Very good, Lloyd, but remember, that's what is supposed to happen.
Right. In our condition, something keeps that from taking place, and you get that hesitation and engine flare-up before the car accelerates. Now, that, of course, means that neither the direct clutch nor the kickdown band is engaged. Since the kickdown band engages when the direct clutch releases during a normal downshift, there's something holding up the band engagement.
I thought the servo restrictor valve was supposed to slow down kickdown band engagement for a smooth downshift.
It is, but at part throttle, the servo restrictor valve should be open to allow for immediate application of the kickdown band. In other words, the servo restrictor valve, in this case, isn't opening soon enough.
Yeah, and since throttle pressure operates the servo restrictor valve, it usually means the throttle pressure is too low.
Right. It's too low to open the restrictor valve the instant the driver's foot touches the accelerator. Remember, throttle pressure too high gives a harsh downshift. Throttle pressure too low causes engine runaway at part throttle. So, throttle pressure must be adjusted properly.
And we should just go ahead and check throttle pressure?
No, you go through the same steps you did when throttle pressure was too high.
You mean check fluid level first and then throttle linkage?
Sure. If there was free play in the linkage, or the linkage wasn't adjusted right, you'd fix it before doing anything else.
Okay. Suppose I found fluid level okay and the throttle linkage okay. Then if I adjusted the throttle pressure, would that correct this runaway condition?
It sure as shooting would if the kickdown band adjustment were okay.
Yeah, a kickdown band too loose makes the kickdown servo piston travel farther before engagement. This could give the engine a chance to rev up before the band made contact.
I got you, Lloyd. After checking all these points, level, linkages, throttle pressure, and kickdown band, we'd road test the car.
Right, oh boy. And then you'd really know what the shifting quality was under all conditions.
And if your road test showed that the condition hadn't been corrected, you'd have to remove the valve body assembly and check it. If that didn't do it, remove the transmission for further checking.
Well, you fellas sure cleared up these downshift cases for me. I've got a better picture of Powerflite operation, too.
Glad you have, George. We just gotta keep up on transmission maintenance.
Truer words were never spoke, Lloyd. I'll bet you there are more than 1 million Powerflites running around, and more are on the way. Keeping those units working smoothly is our best bet to keep our owners sold on our product. But even more important, it keeps them sold on us.